Hi, and welcome to the Airsys IP Site Connect technical webinar. I'm Pero, and I'll be hosting this webinar today. Some general housekeeping rules. Today, this webinar will last no more than 1 hour. All participants will be muted throughout this presentation, and you can access this webinar via our YouTube channel if you've missed it or you'd like to watch it again. So in this series, there will be 3 webinars. Today is IP Site Connect. The next one will be Capacity Plus Single Site, and the last one will be Capacity Plus Multi-Site. Please take a note of the times and dates so that you can be sure to join us then. And what we'll be doing throughout this webinar series is we'll go through the presentation, and at the end, we will look at some real-world examples, some code plug configurations, and some general ways to set up the system so that you hopefully will have a very good understanding of how to set up an IP Site Connect system by yourself. So what we'll be looking at during this webinar is the typical use cases for IP Site Connect, design considerations in fleet mapping, and how to program repeaters and subscriber radios. So what is IP Site Connect? IP Site Connect is a multi-site system where you can connect various repeaters together via IP, and you can roam seamlessly with subscriber radios between the sites. The system will consist of one master repeater, which is the case with all motor turbo systems, and you can have a total of up to 15 sites or repeaters. One master repeater and the rest will all be peer repeaters. And the way the repeaters communicate with each other is that the peer repeaters are configured with the IP address of the master repeater, and on power up, the peers perform a link establishment with the master repeater. And what this does is the master repeater will build up a table of all the peer repeaters in the system, and that's indeed how the master repeater learns of all the other repeaters in the system. The master will never try to communicate with the peers directly. It's always the other way around. So the link establishment process is how the master then learns the IP addresses of all the peer repeaters. So where is IP Site Connect used? It's used where there's a limited number of people that need voice communications over a greater coverage area. And some examples could be schools and universities, airlines, large retail like shopping centers, manufacturing plants with multiple locations. I mean, anyone can use IP Site Connect if they have various different sites and they would like them connected together. You can also link sites where repeaters and radios are on different frequency bands. So let's say you've got some sites on UHF and some on VHF. You can still link those sites together via IP Site Connect. The only limitation is you won't be able to roam from a VHF to a UHF site because the radios can only accommodate one frequency band, but you can still happily link them together and use it as a wide area network. And IP Site Connect transports audio between sites via UDP and IP, so it doesn't care what band the equipment is on. As long as you can connect via IP, you can connect the sites together. So fleet mapping considerations, if there are more channels desired, you can run parallel IP Site Connect systems together. And since you can only have one repeater per site with IP Site Connect, you've only got 2 slots to work with. So if you need more slots, you could always run a second or a third IP Site Connect system in parallel. The systems won't be connected together and they won't know of each other, and it will all run as independent systems, but that won't matter because from a subscriber perspective, these are just conventional channels, so there's no need to designate between the different IP Site Connect systems. You will just program the channels as normal in your subscriber radios, and you'll be able to use all of the systems together. You can also use the same frequencies on different sites, although it's good practice to use unique frequencies, especially where you've got overlapping sites, because it could cause problems with roaming if you try and roam from one site to another where you're using the same frequencies. And in order to roam automatically based on RSSI, you have to configure roam lists for each wide area channel. And this is something we will look at a bit later on. So here you can see two IP Site Connect systems running in parallel. The first system has one repeater with 2 slots on 2 different sites, and the second system also has one repeater on each site with 2 slots. So this gives you a total of 4 slots, but essentially 2 separate IP Site Connect systems. And on the system, subscribers will need to have 4 roam lists programmed in order to roam between the 2 sites and all of the channels. So a roam list should contain one logical channel from each site that corresponds to the wide area channel. And the logical channel consists of the frequency pair, the color code, and the time slot. And if there are multiple channels in the subscriber code plug that reference the same logical channel, only one needs to be added to the roam list. And we'll look at the roam list in more detail as well. And only wide area channels should be added to the roam list. So if you have a site where you would only like a local slot, then that should not be added to the roam list, because obviously you don't want that channel to roam to any of the other sites. And also, the typical way to set up the subscriber radio is to only include one of the sites in the channel zone, so that you can only select between 2 of the slots, since all of the sites will be tied together, and all of the slot 1s and all of the slot 2s will be working together during the roaming. And the way this works is you can have one site in your channel zone, and then all of the other sites you can put in the channel pool. And for those that don't know what the channel pool does, the channel pool can be used to add channels that you can reference in the system, and that can be used, but you cannot select them via the channel selector. And this will become a bit more clear later on. So when a radio automatically roams to another site, it uses the following attributes of the new site: the transmit frequency, the receive frequency, the color code, the time slot, talk around setting, GPS revert channel, emergency system, and the emergency revert channel. So essentially, once you roam to a new site, your radio will basically switch to a new channel, to the channel that the new site is on. Even though your channel selector will be on the same position as before, but your radio is now using the roam list to select the new channel for the new site. And when a radio roams to another site in the roam list, it continues using some attributes of the selected channel. And that's the digital contact, the RX group list, and the channel access parameters. But these parameters should be identical for all of the channels in the roam list, so that won't be an issue anyway. Just make sure that you always set up all of the channels with the same details in your roam list. And then channels from the channel pool may be added to the roam list to prevent a user from directly accessing channels for other sites. And this is useful because if you add all of your channels into the channel zone, every second channel will basically do the same thing. So channel 1 will be slot 1 of site 1. Channel 3 will be slot 1 of site 2. Channel 5 will be slot 1 of site 3, and so on. So there's no need to change between the different channels because you'll only be working with one slot effectively, which is why the channel pool comes very handy. And this is a fleet map of a system with 4 logical channels. So as you can see, there's only 2 time slots, but there's 4 channels and 4 user groups. Now, generally, I would advise to only use one user group per slot, because then you won't have any call queuing or people waiting to use the slot. But you can set it up this way. All it will mean is that if someone is busy on one of the slots, let's say the red group is making a call, then the blue group will have to wait until the channel becomes clear. So generally, it's best to use one user group per slot, and then you won't have any call queuing. So this is an example of the roam list. It references the two channels programmed into the code plug. So you can see in the right-hand table, there are two channels in there, and they are both slot 1 from the two different sites. And you'll always roam between the one slot of all the sites, and you'll have another roam list for slot 2 for the different sites. So these channels can be assigned to a channel position or come from the channel pool. As I said, it's good practice to have one site in the channel zone, and the rest will be put in the channel pool. The RSSI threshold determines at what point the describer starts automatically scanning members in the roam list. And this is something that you'll have to play with, for the given system, because if you have overlapping sites, you might need to set your RSSI threshold level higher or lower so that it begins, scanning for a new site at the right time. And you won't know what this level should be until after the system has been deployed. So this is the site topology for IP Site Connect. It's very simple. All of the sites can sit on the same LAN. So you don't need to have all of your IP Site Connect repeaters sit behind their own router. They will all happily work on the same LAN, all connected together. So you can have, an application where you need to cover the floors of a tall building, and you can have repeaters on every second or every third floor, and they can be connected via the same LAN, and your radios will roam automatically between the repeaters on the different floors. At the same time, you can have your repeaters on different sites geographically, in which case they will sit behind their own router and network, and they will typically go through your ISP, which will interconnect all of the sites together. So fleet mapping is just a way to describe how the radios are programmed so that they work the best way for a given customer. And when we look at fleet mapping for IP Site Connect, it's just determining how the radio communications are set up for each user group in an organization, which talk groups are assigned to certain employees' radios, and how they are set up for the dispatch control positions. Typically, you'll find that different users have different features and functions and privileges. Normal radio users might only have access to certain user groups, whereas a dispatcher will generally have access to all of the groups. They can have features like radio disable, radio enable, remote monitor, and so on. And you also need to decide which features and licenses you might need for the system. So looking at channel frequency considerations, is it a new system, or is it an existing system where a customer might have some standalone sites that they wish to link together? Are the frequencies being used new, or do you need to apply for new Ofcom frequencies? If you have some frequencies already, are they in the right band? Do you need to apply for VHF or UHF frequencies? Have you done propagation studies? So one of the most important things is doing a site survey before you implement the system to make sure that you get the adequate coverage. And lastly, are there any interference issues that need to be addressed? Now, this is something that you typically won't know about until after the system has been deployed. In urban areas like London, big cities, you're almost guaranteed to come across interference issues from time to time. and it can be difficult to address, but you can report interference issues to Ofcom, and they will come out and try and find where the interference is generated from, and try and resolve it that way. If the system is in a rural location, then you're much less likely to come across any interference issues. So subscribers may access multiple IP site connect systems if needed. Separate systems must be separated into their own channel zones in the code plug, and that's just to keep things tidy so that you don't get confused with different systems if they're all selectable via the channel selector. So if you put them in different zones, then at least they'll be separated that way, and you can be sure to access the right system. And when programming radios to operate on multiple sites, make sure the personalities are referencing the correct lists. Otherwise, you might be roaming to the wrong sites and calling the wrong groups and so on. Each IP site connect system should have its own master, and that's the same for any motor turbo system. There should be one master and the rest will be peer repeaters. And there's no need to take the system down when configuring other repeaters. So let's say you've got a 5-site IP site connect system and you would like to add another repeater or another site. You don't need to take the system down. You can program the peer repeater, put it on the new site, connect it up to the network, and that will then perform a link establishment with the repeater, and the repeater will be aware of the new site. But naturally, the subscriber radios must be programmed for any new channels, because they won't be aware unless you physically program those new channels in. Since you can only scan or roam, but not both, if you are only roaming on the system, TX preambles in the configuration should be configured to 0 instead of the 960 milliseconds default. So this is something that I've never really done in all of the IP site connect systems I've done before. I've left the TX preambles at the default 960 milliseconds. It's never caused me any problems, but you can set it to 0. And all that will mean is, there's a slight delay in front of the transmission, which, if you set it to 0, which will disappear. Like I say, it's barely noticeable. You can do it, but I've never done it before. And channel access in IP site connect should be polite. So what this means is you shouldn't key up over someone else. So you shouldn't transmit when someone else is using the channel. Because if you do, it means you can miss a transmission. Or, when users talk over each other, especially in a digital radio system, the audio for both calls can go missing. Not like in analog, when people key up over each other, you can still hear what the user is saying. So it's good to be polite, and then what that means is you set the channel access to either color code only or channel free, which means that if someone is using the channel, you won't be able to key up, and you'll get a busy tone until the channel becomes free. So if we look at the peer repeater programming, the main configuration items are the radio ID, features, the network settings. So in the peer repeater, you'll set the link type to peer because it is a peer repeater. You'll have the master IP address because you need to point to the master to perform the link establishment. And you'll also point to the master's UDP port. You'll have the peer repeater's own IP address and its own UDP port. And UDP ports in an IP site connect system should be unique for the different repeaters. And you'll also set the beacon duration and the beacon interval. And what the beacon does is, if your subscriber radio is idle, it will listen out for beacons from the repeaters. And what that does is it tells the subscriber radio that you are connected to the IP site connect system. When you move outside of the coverage area of the system, and it stops receiving that beacon from the repeater, the radio will then start an active roaming, and it will try and find any of the repeaters in the roam list. And if you are so far out of coverage that you can't connect to any of the repeaters in the site, then it will just continually try and scan through the roam list until you are back in the coverage area. And continuing with the peer repeater programming, you'll also configure the zones and channels. And for each channel, the color code, the TX and RX frequencies, the power level, etc., IP side connect time slot. And you can set either both or one of the time slots to be a wide area channel. So if you want to use both slots in the repeater as wide area slots, then you can select both. Or if you want to use one of the slots as a wide area slot and one as a local area, you can do that as well. When we look at the master repeater programming, it will be very much the same, but the link type will be set to master because this is the master IP, the master repeater. And you will have the master IP address and master UDP port. And these will be repeated in the next two fields because this is the master repeater. So you will essentially point towards the master repeater itself. So you will have two master IP addresses and two master UDP ports. We will look at the networking afterwards as well, because that could be slightly different depending on how you set the system up. And for the subscriber programming, the main configuration items are the radio ID, beacon interval, and that must be the same as in the repeaters. Whichever features you want to enable, the buttons, the menu, text messages, digital contacts, emergency system, zones and channels, and the roam list. So the repeater programming is very simple. There's very little that you need to configure. Most of the configuration is in the subscriber radios, and we will look at this in more detail in the CPS after this. So this is the end of the presentation. Next, we will be looking at the code plugs and how the systems are set up, and then hopefully by the end of that, it will give you a good understanding of how to set up your own IP side connect system. So here we have the peer repeater in an IP side connect system, and we will start from the general settings page and go through the items that you need to configure in order for this to work as an IP side connect repeater. So starting at the top, you've got the radio alias. This can be anything you want. You can call it, something that makes sense for the site. I've called it peer site 2. It needs a unique radio ID. Again, you can call that pretty much what you want. Your timers can stay default unless you want to change them for something specific. You can set your power level according to your Ofcom license, and the rest you can leave as default. Then in the next section, if you look under network, we've got the radio IP. This is the IP address for the accessory when you program the repeater via the programming cable. So this is not something that we'll look at. And this is where you set the repeater's own IP address. So you can see this peer repeater has an IP address of 192.168.5.104. And it's got the gateway IP, which will be the router IP address, and the subnet mask. All very simple. And if we look at the link establishment, so this is where you set the repeater up to connect to the master repeater. But first of all, you need to set the link type, which in this instance would be peer, because it is a peer repeater. And then you reference your master IP address. So there's two fundamental ways in which this can be done. You can point towards the master's local IP address, which is what I've done here. And if you do it this way, you need to set up VPNs between your sites, because that will mean that you are effectively putting the sites on the same LAN, and you can communicate with the master's local IP address. The second instance is you can point towards the master site's WAN address. So this will be the WAN address of the site router. And this will be typically given by your ISP. And we can look at the diagram shortly that will explain that better. You also have your master UDP port, which is 50,010, and then the peer repeater's own UDP port is 50,011. You can set this to anything you want, as long as it's in the 50,000 range and upwards. As long as it's unique, it'll work fine. And then your beacon duration and interval, you can set this again to pretty much anything you like, but Motorola recommends that the duration is set to 720 milliseconds and the beacon interval to 10 seconds. So let's have a look at the network diagram to explain the networking a bit better. So here is a simple diagram of the IP Site Connect system networking. As you can see, there are two fundamental ways in which this can be set up. The first is to point towards the master site's WAN IP address, and the second is by creating a VPN between the sites. If we look at number one, I have a typical WAN address here that you get from your ISP, which might be something like 185.121.25.86. And if you follow this procedure, you will reference in your peer repeater this WAN IP address as the master's IP address. But this isn't actually the master repeater's IP address. This is just your public address of your site router. And if you do it this way, you will have to do some port forwarding. And why do you have to do that? It's because once the traffic arrives at the router, the site router needs to know what to do with that traffic. And to forward that traffic to the master repeater, you will have to port forward the traffic that comes in on UDP port 50,010 to the master's local IP address. And this is usually, easily done in most routers. It should take you only a couple of minutes to set this up. But all it means is your peer repeater will try and connect through your WAN network to the site router. The site router then needs to forward the traffic to the master repeater, and it will do that once you do the port forwarding on your UDP port to your master's IP address. The second way you can do it is if you have a VPN between the sites. So if you have a VPN, in your peer repeater, you will now reference the master repeater's local IP address, which is 192.168.4.112. And if you do it this way, you would not need to do any port forwarding because you are directly communicating with the repeater already. I usually set up my systems with VPNs created between all of the sites. I find it easier, you've got more control, and it's more secure because the traffic is encrypted, but it's entirely up to you. You can use either of these methods. So now we're back in the CPS. Let's look at the channel configuration. If you go into the channel zone, you'll see there's one channel added. It's a digital channel. What you have to set is the channel name, which can be anything, the color code, and then IP site connect. So here you can select either slot 1 and slot 2, slot 1 only, slot 2 only, or none. If you're going to use both slots as wide area channels, then you can set both to slot 1 and slot 2. And then you need to fill in your frequencies, set your power level, and that's you done for the peer repeater. Next, let's look at the master repeater. So here we have the master repeater code plug. If we go into general settings, it's very much the same as the peer repeater. You give the radio or the repeater an alias. I've called this master site 1, and you give it a separate or different radio ID. And then the timers should all be the same as before. Your power level and everything else will be the same as in the peer repeater. If we look at the network setup, here you can see that the master's IP address is 192.168.4.112. The gateway IP is 192.168.4.1, which will be your router's IP address, and your subnet mask. And then if we look at the link establishment, the link type is now set to master, because this is the master repeater. And remember, there will only be one master repeater for any given IP site connect system. So this will only be set up once. The master IP address, as you can see, is the same as its own IP address, which is 192.168.4.112. And that's because there is a VPN created between the master and the peer sites. If I didn't have a VPN between the sites, then this field would have had the WAN IP address of the master site router. So just remember that for the future. The master UDP port is 50,010, and because this is the master repeater, the UDP port is repeated. And the beacon duration and interval are the same as in the peer repeater, and they will be the same in all of the repeaters of the system. If we look at this channel zone, again, there's one digital channel. And same as before, you give it a name. This is just called site 1, a color code, and then the IP site connect slots are both set to slot 1 and 2 as before, because we're using both slots as wide area channels. And then you add your frequencies, which are different from the peer site, and all of the frequencies in my sites generally are unique. And then you set your power level, and that's the programming for the master repeater. Next, we'll look at the subscriber programming. So here we have the subscriber profile. This is a DP4400E. So let's start from the beginning. Under general settings, again, you can give the radio an alias. This is just the standard Motorola that you get by default. You should give the radio a unique ID. And then the rest of the settings here you can leave as default, unless you want to change them for a specific customer if they're requested. I mean, there's quite a few settings in here, none which will have an impact on getting this working on an IP site connect system, so we won't go through all of that. There's no network settings to be done in the subscriber radios, because that's all handled by the repeaters. So next, we will look at the contacts. So you need to create a contact that will be used in your channel setup. And I've got one group call. It's a digital group call, and it's got a call ID of 185. And I called it WAC group, which stands for Wide Area Channel Group. And if you look at your RX group list, that same group is referenced as a member. So these two groups work together. Next, if we look at the channel zone, As you can see, there's two channels in here, one for site 1, slot 1, and another channel for site 1, slot 2. So remember when I said earlier on, you should program one of the sites in your channel zone, which should be selected or selectable by the channel selector, and then the other sites should be put in the channel pool. So since this is only a two-site system, this is the first site that's in the channel zone, and if we look at the channel pool, you can see that the second site is in the channel pool. So this is site 2, slot 1, and site 2, slot 2. We will go into the channel settings in a bit, but let's just look at the roam list. So if you go down to scan list and then roam list, you will see that there are two roam lists created here. If we click on the first one, you will see that we've got all of the channels that we've set up in our system in this section here. Once you've added channels to your channel pool and your channel zone, all of those channels will appear in the available section here, and you need to make them members of the roam list. So because we want to scan between slot 1 of site 1 and slot 1 of site 2, we will make them members of this first roam list. And in the second roam list, you can see we've made slot 2 of both sites members of this list, because you will always want to roam between one of the slots on all of the sites and one of the slots or the second slot on all of those other sites as well. You will never roam between slot 1 and slot 2, because that will just make things confusing. You will always roam between the same slot. So if we go back into the channel zone and we look at the actual channel setup, I've just given it a name, so WAC, wide area channel, site 1, slot 1. And the very next setting down, you can see scan or roam list. You need to select the roam list that's appropriate for this channel. If I click on the drop-down list, you can see I can select one of the two roam lists here. Because this is site 1 and slot 1, I want to roam between slot 1 of the two sites, and therefore I will select roam list 1. And similarly, when we look at the other channel, if we want to roam between the site slot 2s, then we will select roam list 2. You need to select the repeater time slot. Because this is slot 1 and we roam for slot 1, we will select time slot 1 in the repeater. Going down, you need to make sure that you have IP site connect enabled. And this is where you set your RSSI threshold level. By default, it's minus 108 dBm. You can set this to any level that you want, and that will work best for your system. But the only way you'll really know what works best is once you've got the system set up and you've got some radios in the field. Then you'll add your frequencies. You will add your contact name, which is WAC group, and the RX group list. And here you can see the admit criteria is set to color code free. So this is set up to be polite. If you select always, that means this channel will operate impolitely, which means that you can transmit over other users, which is not a good idea. So either select channel free or color code free. If you have it on color code free, that means that even if the channel is busy, where someone else might be on the same frequency, as long as your color code is free, it will let you key up on your channel. So if we now look at the second channel, so the second channel is called wide area channel site 1 slot 2. And here we have roam list 2 selected because we want to roam between the slot 2 of site 1 and site 2. We've got our color code selected, and now you can see repeater time slot 2 is selected. And if we go down, IP site connect is enabled, and again the default RSSI threshold of -108 is selected here, and it's the same for the frequency setup, the group list, and the contact name. Because you're using two different slots, you can use the same contact name, and it won't interfere with the other channel because it's on a separate slot. And again, the admit criteria is set to color code 3, same as before, which is the best way to do it. If we now look at the channel pool, we've got the site 2 repeater added here. So if we have a look at the channel setup, it's exactly the same as the other channels, but this is only for site 2. So this is the repeater on site 2, and slot 1 is set up here. You can see roam list 1 is selected because it's for slot 1. Repeater time slot 1 is selected as before. Everything is the same. IP site connect is enabled. RSSI threshold is the same. These are different frequencies now because you're on the second site. And again, the same contact name and group list is used. And you'll use the same contact name and group list throughout all of the repeaters. And the rest of the parameters are set the same. So just to make it a bit clear, in your channel zone, you can only select these two channels. So slot 1 and slot 2 of the first site. And the reason you use the channel pool is so that you don't add the second site in here and confuse things, because you've only got the two slots you can work with. And where the channel pool channels are referenced is inside your roam list. So when you click on your roam list, you can see these are the site 1 slots, and these are the site 2 slots. And wherever you've got roam list 2 selected, these channels will be referenced and used. So if we go back to zone 1, and we click on the second channel, you can see that roam list 2 is enabled here, or selected here, which means it will bring the channels from the channel pool into this channel setup when the radio roams to the new site. And that's why you don't have to have them in the channel zone, because you don't have to manually select them. It will automatically roam to the channels in this list where they come from the channel pool. So that's basically the setup of the subscriber radios. If you have any more questions or queries, or if anything is still unclear, please do get in touch. I will walk you through any problems you might have. If you want to try and set up an IP site connect system on your own, that will give you a good idea on how much you understand. And if there's any problems, send me an email or give me a call, and we can go through it then. So we've come to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for joining, and hopefully we will see you at the next one.